want to worry,
Okay.
give it to Davida.
Okay.
Davida's can come and visit us, and we have lots of events like this one today where we're highlighting the ideas of the African diaspora. We're super excited for this workshop and lecture today. We've been working on it for about 6 or 7 months with J Mase in the Seattle Public Library. So from here, I'm going to welcome my colleague, friend, inspiration, C. Davida Ingram.
Woo!
Hi everyone. Happy Saturday to you. Welcome to It Is Your God, a Violent God, a theology for survivors with J Mase III. What you might know is that we're going to talk about how religion has impacted the ways we experience violence as targeted communities. And we'll tell you a little bit more in a moment, but we wanted just to start with a land acknowledgement. So we want to say, we know that in Seattle and everywhere in the U.S. we are on indigenous lands. Right here we happen to be on the ancestral homelands of Coast Salish people, including the Duwamish tribe. And we also want to note that these lands hold ancestral significance for the Muckleshoot, Tulalip, and Suquamish tribes. We also acknowledge that African ancestors were brought to Turtle Island. And together we have kept and tended to African and indigenous culture here. So we support indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation. My name is C. Davida Ingram, and I'm Public Engagement Programs Manager at the Seattle Public Library. I am delighted to introduce our speaker for today. He is J Mase III. J Mase III is a Black, trans, queer poet and educator who is based in Seattle by way of Philly. As an educator, J Mase has worked with thousands of community members in the US, UK, and Canada on the needs of the LGBTQIA+ communities, with a mindfulness about racial justice in spaces such as K-12 schools, universities, faith communities, and restricted care facilities. He is founder of Awkward, the first trans and queer people of color talent agency. J Mase is author of And Then I Got Fired, one trans queer's reflection on grief, unemployment, and inappropriate jokes about death, as well as white folks be tripping, and ethnography through poetry and prose. As a performer, he has shared stages with artists like Chuck D, the Indigo Girls, Billy Porter, and MJ Rodriguez. His work has been featured on MSBC, Essence Live, Everyday Feminism, Black Girl Dangerous, The New York Times, BuzzFeed, Blavity, The Root, The Huffington Post, TEDx, and more. Currently, he is head writer for the theatrical production Black Boys and is co-editor of the Black Trans Prayer Book. Find him on Instagram at J Mase III and www.jmase3.com. I am looking forward to passing it over to J Mase just in a moment, but I wanted to acknowledge that this program is made possible with the support of Wanawari. We're thrilled to have Wanawari as our producer for today's event, and with support from the Seattle Public Library Foundation. After we have a keynote from J Mase, we'll have an interactive workshop. I wanted to acknowledge we are recording this session with J Mase. We will not be recording the workshop, and that's to hold confidentiality. We also wanted to share that when it comes to talking about subjects like being a survivor, we acknowledge that that can be triggering, and we want to make sure that you can take care of yourself. Please take a breath, hydrate, and let us know in the chat if you need support. And without further ado, passing it over to J Mase.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. So good afternoon or evening, depending on where you all are.
I don't see the video yet.
Okay. We're waiting for the video to come up. Okay. All right. So again, happy good afternoon to everybody, or evening, depending on where you are in the country watching us, or where in the world you might be watching us. My name is J Mase III, and I'm grateful that you all are here to talk about Is Your God a Violent God? Finding a Theology for Survivors. This is a snippet of a framework that I'm using to put together a book that will be coming out on Bemba Press in 2022. So just thank y'all for, as community, showing up and allowing us to keep each other accountable. So I'm going to try to keep my portion, my talk, to about 15 minutes, so then we can do a Q&A and jump into the workshop, as Davida mentioned. And I want to start out with...
Oh, wait.
Oops.
Okay, so they can't hear anything.
They can't hear anything. Okay.
So it might be my sound. 1 second. Check sound again, please.
Checking sounds. Checking sounds.
I see you have sound, but I can't unmute myself and post needs to unmute it.
Yeah, because I did that. 1 second.
Okay.
Sorry.
Checking sounds.
That might be what happened.
Checking sounds.
And that is TS. One second. Sorry.
No worries.
Trying to, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay. Is sound on now?
We're just doing a quick sound
Yeah,
check.
sound check. Can everyone hear me in the, can everyone hear in the room right now?
I'm muted, so I forgot. Can people hear sound? Let us know. Yes.
Okay.
We have sound now.
Okay, we have sound.
We have
Yes.
sound now.
Okay, we have sound. Yes. Shout out to Tari and Elishma doing all the tech stuff today. So, good afternoon and good evening to everybody, depending on where you are, where in the world you might be watching this feed from. So again, my name is J Mase III, and today I'm doing a quick framework for my upcoming book, Is Your God a Violent God? Finding a Theology for Survivors, which is going to be out on Bemba Press in 2022. And just thank you, community, for being here as we work through these issues and work through this language together. So I'm hoping that today we get through a lot of framework that is useful for all survivors of violence, right? And all survivors of different types of interpersonal and institutional violence, okay? So I want to ask y'all a question that I think my grandmother might haunt me about, okay? So just get ready for this question. But have you ever once thought, wow, church people are mean, okay? Let us know in the chat if you've ever thought that. I'm someone, as a black person, as a trans person, that does a lot of work on racial justice, on trans liberation, on talking about domestic violence and sexual violence in secular and faith spaces. So secular spaces like K through 12 schools, universities, medical spaces, shelters, things like that, and faith communities of all kinds. And I have to tell you that working on justice issues, particularly in faith spaces, is the most difficult, right? Because often when people only have access to oppressive theologies, they can be very righteous in their wrong, right? They can be very righteous in their wrong. I'm gonna ask for the next slide to pop up. Yep. Elisha's doing many hats today. Thank you so much. Shout out to Elisha. Okay, so yeah, so what does it mean when we're in situations when folks might have an understanding that violence exists, but not know how to actually show up for survivors? And so what we're going to kind of delve into is, why are people often in religious spaces on the wrong side of justice, right? And on the wrong side of survivors, okay? And when we talk about survivors, I just want to tell you that who I'm talking about is anyone who has experienced physical, sexual, state, and or psychological violence that has been impacted by religious trauma. So I'm going to read that again. Anyone who has experienced physical, sexual, state, and or psychological violence that has been impacted by religious trauma. If that seems like a wide net, it's supposed to be, right? Because I want this to be a theology that serves all survivors, right? So why? So my why is a number of years ago, I got out of a relationship that was abusive, right? And turned into domestic violence, right? And I was part of a very big and large religious community, as was my partner. And I remember reaching out to religious leaders in my community to ask them for support and for help on intervention, right? And I realized very quickly that religious leaders that were in my community might have, again, really understood that, oh, domestic violence is wrong, but actually had no skills or understanding or framework on how to actually intervene on behalf of survivors. So I actually had to get all my support outside of the religious communities that I thought was actually where I developed my morality from, right, which didn't feel great to me. Also, when I sat back a few years after the relationship, right, not in the moment, but years after the relationship, and I meditated on some things, I realized it wasn't actually my first abusive relationship, right? It was just the first relationship that I was able to articulate as being abusive because it became violent, and I acknowledged and had to acknowledge I actually had a very low bar of understanding when power dynamics were off or when my own trauma was becoming normalized. Let us know in the chat if you've experienced an awareness like that, okay? Let us know in the chat or in the comments if you're watching this on the replay. Whatever works for you, whatever's clever, okay? So we can move forward on the slides, okay? So going back to that idea of morality, that oftentimes religious spaces see themselves and perceive themselves as being the starting places of morality. However, they're often without accountability for any kind of harmful theologies that they might perpetuate that go out to not just the religious community, but the world at large and cause harm in the world at large. And so there can be no morality without accountability. So that's also something that a theology for survivors has to acknowledge. Okay? So primarily what we're doing is, again, talking about these theologies of survivors. Before we even get into really what that looks like, I want to talk about what is a theology of violence? Like, what does that actually look like? How does that manifest in our religious life and secular life, all that different stuff, right? So let's see some examples. So theologies of violence, which I think are way more mainstream. You can see them everywhere. Every religious organization you might be a part of, you can see theologies of violence. So don't tell me you've never experienced it. You've experienced it. You just might not know that that was what you were witnessing because it is so normalized. So some examples within religious spaces might be maybe a Babylao refusing to support the initiation of trans or queer practitioners, right? Maybe it is a pastor telling a young person that outing their abuser is not what God would want, right? Maybe it is a religious leader equating wealth with signs of holiness, right? So let us know if these are some frameworks that you've seen in the world at large, okay? Another point I want to make is that Black, brown, and indigenous folks, trans and queer folks, disabled folks, broke folks, survivors of sexual assault, survivors of state violence, and other targeted communities experience religious trauma both in the secular and religious world. If you are someone who feels, that maybe you ran away from religion, unfortunately, when it comes to the mainstreamness of some of these toxic theologies, we can never fully get away. They're everywhere, right? And so we actually have to replace that which is mainstream with something that is actually functional, okay? So how does it show up in the secular world, right? So it can show up when we think about incarceration over policing. What else is the incarceration system except for a system of morality without any accountability for actually the people that create that system, right? Thinking about manifest destiny, right? As we watch and have watched the Supreme Court and other legal systems within the United States talk about the worthiness of white settler colonial states to expand constantly, right? Thinking about the disavowing of bodily autonomy, especially for non-cis het men, able-bodied folks, right? So if you are non-cis het able-bodied man, right, the ways in which our rights to bodily autonomy are always in question from a stance of morality, right? And of course, even most recently seeing the COVID-19 spread, we saw a lot of religious communities and institutions trying to create a world in which COVID did not necessarily impact them, but also the rest of the world, right? And we, as the rest of the world, dealt with and are still dealing with those impacts, right? So these are some very clear ways that it impacts us in secular life, okay? We can move forward.
Okay, do you want some of the comments?
Oh yeah, if there's any comments.
Just definitely some amens here about some of the things you mentioned. People did experience mean stuff in the in religious spaces.
So people
but also people
felt
really
this.
thanking
Yep.
you for the African example there. Two people experienced that not being accepted.
Well, yeah, and so especially because a lot of times doing this work, people assume because they're not Christian that they don't have to worry about this stuff. Because often when we talk about interfaith stuff, we're only talking about Christianity and maybe one other tradition like that, and that's it. And that's not how we live our lives. And that, again, that patriarchy impacts all of our systems that exist in the West. White supremacy impacts all of our stuff in the West and beyond. All these things are interconnected, most definitely. So I'm glad that speaks to y'all. Other systems that are also impacted by theologies of violence within the secular world, education system, thinking about what young people are and are not allowed to learn based off of, again, a morality framework about what is age appropriate, right, for a young person to learn and who gets to make those decisions, right? The medical system about who and is not worthy of care. Who is and is not worthy of being believed when they say something is wrong, right? And how that intersects with blackness, how that intersects with indigeneity, how that intersects with transness, with fatness, with disability, all of those things, right? Thinking also about the criminal justice system, again, which we talked about, and about that system, and capitalism, because capitalism, right? Like, obviously capitalism. And of course, the nonprofit industrial complex for all my folks who have been chucking along in the nonprofit industrial complex. Just want to give you all a shout out too. Okay, so moving forward. Okay, so a theology for survivors does primarily two things, or I want it to and imagine it doing two things. So one, it creates opportunities for those who have experienced violence to heal, right? So it creates opportunities for those who have experienced violence to heal, because we deserve places to heal, right? And two, it supports the conditions in which religious institutions can be held accountable for harm, right? And we must create conditions in which religious institutions can be held accountable for harm. And we'll talk about this again later, but a theology for survivors is not invested in how do we support religious institutions above all else. It's about how do we support survivors, right? And so it doesn't matter if you are someone who is trying to stay in a religious institution, has left a religious institution, is just merely impacted. There's a chance that you got some religious trauma and you deserve to heal from that, especially as it impacts your other types of violence that you might experience, okay? One thing that comes up for me, and this is from James H. Cone, and this is a paraphrase, but so in God of the Oppressed, James H. Cone, who is the father of Black Liberation Theology, says something to the effect that liberation isn't good news for everyone. Because if you're hearing what I'm saying and are like, well, why haven't religious institutions that see themselves as so moral, that see themselves as so wonderful, why haven't they already mainstreamed theologies of survivors, right? And the reality is, this exact fact, right? That institutions of religion are still institutions of power. They hold monetary wealth, they hold land, they hold titles, they hold all things, right? And so there's a lot of people within religious institutions that are passively taking part in certain traditions, and there's a lot of people within religious institutions with lots of institutional power that are holding on to things because they know that actually showing up for survivors of violence, showing up for justice, means to disavow them of their own power, right? So let me know in the chat if that makes sense to you, right? And what I also want to point out about this particular space is that when James H. Cone was talking about this, he wasn't just talking about this from a framework of those who held power, but also those who coddled up to and cuddled up with power, right? So that even those that come from different types of oppressed communities can still benefit from the oppression of others and their colleagues if they can get some goodies on the side directly from those in power, okay? Let me know if that makes sense to you too. Okay, we can go forward.
People are saying it makes sense.
I'm glad. Thank you for making sure I get to hear what the people saying in the chat, okay? So thank y'all out there, okay? So liberation theology focused on survivors of violence would decentralize systems of power and again, recenter the most targeted, right? So it would decenter systems of power and recenter the most targeted. When I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking so much, so I gotta tell y'all about a mistake I made. So a mistake I made was when I was starting research on my book, I went to the library without my glasses. This is the mistake I made, right? And I picked up a bunch of books, okay? One of those books I thought was a book about goddess culture. It was not. It was a book about goodness culture, okay? And so I opened up the book. It's a very popular book on goodness within church communities. And it was actually a book that talked about the Me Too movement. And I was reading it because I'm like, I already picked it up. I gotta see it through, right? So I'm going through the book. And it had something that was very common to me about the ways it handled specifically the Me Too movement. So the whole book talks about the Me Too movement. And the issue for me was that when they were talking about issues around assault for the ways that especially those that experience gender-based violence deal with them, they were talking about it from a framework of what individual person can we expel from our church to make it not violent? What practice can we stop? But again, all of it led back to how do we strengthen this particular religious denomination, right? Instead of, again, how do we center the survivors? Because theology centered on survivors says, is this institution in service of the people? If this institution is not in service of the people, it doesn't need to exist, period. No institution, regardless of how big or how old, is too big to fail. And we need to actually treat our religious institutions like that too when they cause continued harm, okay? So it starts with an interview. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna share just a couple different quotes from folks that I've been using to help me put together the book. And so what I did and what I'm doing is I surveyed, and I'm trying to survey up to 200 people. I'm still in process with the book, but so I'm trying to survey up to 200 community members on their experiences of accountability, violence, and as survivors within faith traditions. And again, across all different types of religious institutions. I'm also doing some longer form interviews with folks that again that are activists, that are organizers, some that are part of religious institutions, and some that have fled religious institutions altogether. And so we're just going to take a sneak peek at two of the quotes that are going to be in the book, okay? So a question I asked to some folks within the surveys was, what did your religious, faith, or spiritual community teach you about accountability? So what did your religious, faith, or spiritual community teach you about accountability, okay? And we'll go to this next slide, okay? And this person said that there was none. It was our Islamic duty to forgive if someone asked for it, no matter how bad they hurt us or how much their belief in my right not to exist was apparent. On Eid, we also hug our enemies, right? And so this person that had experienced different types of familial violence, physical violence, all these different things, at the end of the day, learned throughout the entirety of their lifetime of being a devout practitioner that they did not deserve accountability, right? Okay, let's go to the next one. Next one is, what do you feel like you learned about love at your church, right? So this is a longer one, because I think, what's the point of accountability if we don't learn to love better? Love on ourselves better, love on others better. So I asked this one person who is an activist and an organizer, what do you feel like you learned about love at your church? And she said, love was sacrificial. That you had to sacrifice your own time, your own money, your own capacity, your own desires to show up for others. And I saw that happen often from black women. So often the folks that are most targeted are the ones that have to sacrifice the most for this larger institution to keep on going and running and functioning, right? Without actual expectations of care for themselves, okay? And so lastly, what I'm going to share with y'all is honing in on a theology for survivors is an essential part of learning how to love ourselves and others. It is about healing from the very real and often unnamed trauma that theologies of violence imprint onto our spiritual and secular lives, okay? So I'm hoping that sinks in with y'all. I want to, from here, I'm going to actually close down this part of the talk so that we can open it up for questions and answers. We can put, we got the lovely Q&A slide here. Q&A. And so I would love to hear some of y'all's questions, and I'll hopefully have some answers, or we'll figure it out together. So thanks, y'all.
Yeah, I also just wanted to mention that one person said they learned that love is conformity and pushing others into it.
Okay, someone learned that love is conformity and pushing others into it. Yes. And that's the thing, because so the way I got into Liberation Theology is I was working for an LGBTQ youth center over on the East Coast. And when you work with LGBTQ young people, you know that about 40% of all homeless young people in the U.S. Are people who are also LGBTQ, right? And a lot of that is because of the ways that people are pushed out of their homes because of religious indoctrination or certain types of religious theologies. And so, to me, I ended up finding and having to get into places where I had to learn how to talk to families and young people about, just how to reframe some of those conversations, because I was experiencing parents who were hurt that they were causing trauma to their young people, but thought they were somehow saving their eternal souls. And so that's a larger thing to kind of navigate too, right?
If there's any questions, you can throw those in the chat.
Yeah. We love all questions.
If you feel comfortable, like
Yeah.
Leah said.
And again, we'll have a space for a workshop, which is not going to be filmed or everything like that. And also, and so the part that's being filmed, so we're not going to film who said what. So the filming part is just what's happening here. So if you ask a question there, it's not going to say, this person asked this at 2:09 p.m., okay? That's good stuff.
Cool. Let's see. I don't see anything right now.
You don't see any questions? Y'all don't have no questions? I'm gonna sit here with my Jeopardy song.
Oh, do you have any suggestions around healing?
Do I have any suggestions around healing? I have a lot of suggestions around healing. And so some of those we're gonna do some exercises in the workshop and things like that. But honestly, for me, what was most important about healing was learning that other people weren't in charge of my spiritual journey. That to me, when people, I grew up in a Muslim and Christian background and Muslim household, and people often ask me, oh, well, how do you identify now? And honestly, I identify as a person of faith who gets to be whatever I want, all the time. That I'm no longer committed to just one religious institution or any space, but that I'm committed to my survival and the survival of primarily Black trans people, but Black folks as a whole, and Black, brown, indigenous folks, and everyone. So I think even just being able to be honest with yourself about the harm that maybe you've normalized. I don't know if anyone's ever had an experience where maybe you were telling a story about something that for you was normal, and then someone, after hearing your story, said, oh wow, that was really messed up, or wow, or you thought it was going to be funny, and that person was like, that was terrible, are you okay? There's lots of ways in which we get so used to the dysfunction that sometimes we're forced to exist in an anti-Black world, anti-trans world, ableist world, all those things. Yeah. So I think that's the first thing.
That's my biggest challenge with my parent about saving my soul. It's causing strife in our relationship, and I fear my parents will never be able to see me in my divinity as a Black, queer, non-binary person. What does that conversation look like, or any resources?
Oh, so what does that conversation look like about parents that specifically, I'm not sure if people can hear both things.
Yeah,
but,
okay.
Yeah, so the question was really primarily about parents not being able to understand the divinity or accept the divinity of Black, non-binary people, or how do you kind of accept people that are kind of still in this how you deal with parents that have this still turmoil about the religious nature piece. And so I would say I'll use my parents as an example. When I came out, and I came out over periods of time in different types of ways, but when I was coming out, the Muslim side of my family had a very rich theology of, no one else can tell you about what your journey with Allah or with God or with faith is, right? So when I came out, did all of my Muslim family understand transness or queerness? No, that's never happened, right? But people were at a place and were more readily to say oh, this is what your name is now, this is where you sit, this is what you do, this is how you do practices. Okay, we'll work on that, right? Versus I found the Christian side of my family really learned from a place of passivity. my mother's theology had to change to open to the real world and the world that she loved. And so what I often tell people is, look at the fruits of your theology, right? So the fruits of your theology cause people to be houseless, cause people to experience physical violence, cause people harm, right? Does that match up with your image of God? Do you imagine God to be a violent God? Like that, just like this question I'm asking, do you imagine God to be this, right? It took my mother, I will say, about 10 years for her theology to be able to open up through some intentional work. I would say that the first conversation, even first conversations that you have with your families around that stuff is never the last conversation. And people, so some resources I would say, I think, the Black Trans Prayer Book is a really great resource. I think there's a book called Otherwise Christian. I think from that piece, there was a Christian family.
It doesn't say, but it doesn't say.
Okay. If it's not Christian, then we'll talk about that. One of my favorite stories is
Yes, Christian.
Oh, yes, Christian. There's also this guy, Peterson Thomas Toscano, who does a play called Transfigurations, where he talks about trans characters in the Bible. My favorite person, and that he was my first introduction into the story of Yusuf in a trans way. So Joseph in Genesis, Yusuf in the Quran, which we can talk about more in the workshop, but I'm very obsessed with this story and this potentially trans character in the text. Even in, and so there's lots of also trans stuff in the Bible that we could definitely talk about, which I think, through Peterson's stuff, the Otherwise Christian, and even some of my work online also address this. Yeah.
Your next question is, do you see possibility for institutional change?
Do I see possibility for institutional change? That would take humility that a lot of institutions don't have, right? And so do I think that some faith traditions and practices and religious traditions will, transform and can transform to meet a theology for survivors? Yes, definitely. Do I think a lot of them can? No. Do I think that most of the ones that we've experienced can? No. I love faith, and I also sometimes want to abolish religion, if I'm honest with you, just because in the ways like anytime you create a hierarchy in which other people are seen as closer to God or spirit or source than the people, right? You create a situation of inequity by fault, right? And that's a larger conversation. That makes sense. That makes sense for y'all? Okay, good stuff. Tariq's like, yes, that makes sense. Thank you. Okay.
So you got some thank yous, and I don't see anything else. So if anybody has one more question, otherwise we'll break for 10 minutes and then go into the workshop portion.
Yeah, I'm gonna dust off some of this sweat. I know y'all see me sweating. See me sweat. That's listen, that's white supremacy right there. Trying to take me out. Okay.
Yeah, I don't see anything, so I'm gonna
Okay. So thank y'all again so much, and I'll see y'all in a few minutes for the workshop if there are no other questions. And also in the workshop, you can still feel free to ask questions, because guess what? I'll be there, okay? How great is that? So thank y'all so much, and I'll see y'all just in about 10.
Yes, so we'll be back at 4:45 to be exact. You can just stay logged into the Zoom, put yourself on mute, and the video is turning off, and we'll be in a safe space. Thank you so much, everybody. See you at 4:45. Okay, I'm on mute. That's the most important part of that.